The galaxy remembers what it chooses, and what it does not choose it erases. In those erasures lie the Emperor's darkest truths, 2 of his sons struck from the record, condemned to silence. Yet silence is not absence. It is only a shadow, and every shadow has a source. One of those shadows began with a child hurled into the storm of the warp. When the Primarchs were scattered, their capsules streaked like burning meteors across the Imperium. Some emerged scarred, but intact, destined for the worlds where fate would forge them into gods of war. One capsule, however, did not escape so easily. Pod Nevinth was torn from the path and dragged screaming into a whirlpool of raw warp energy. The shell held, ceramite and adamantium defying annihilation, but the soul inside could not be spared from the touch of the storm. When the warp finally spat the pod back into real space, it carried something altered, something that would never be whole again. It fell on Dros Lysara, a dying world circling a fading sun. The surface was scarred with rust and slag, skies bruised, green with poison storms, towers hollowed out and collapsed into pits. The people lived in endless tunnels beneath the crust, the Skira, miners and scavengers who believed in nothing beyond survival. They never looked to the stars. They had no gods. They had no hope. Yet one night they watched the heavens split open and a burning coffin fall from above. They called it the Coffin of Fire, and some dared whisper it was a gift. An old foreman named Vilda found the shattered pod among slag heaps. He thought he had discovered a corpse. Instead he found a boy, silent and still, eyes glowing faintly like coals in the dark. The boy never cried. He never wailed or screamed. He only watched. By 12 he towered over grown men. At 14 he bent iron bars as though they were reeds. At 16, when a tunnel collapsed, he braced his shoulders beneath the falling stone and held back death until every miner had escaped. They named him Izar, he who bears the weight. And indeed he bore more than stone. He bore their hope, carried their broken bodies, carried their trust. Yet in his dreams, he carried something heavier still. Each night he saw giants standing around him, brothers, though he could not name them. Their faces were blurred, their voices muffled, their weapons radiant with strange symbols. Always at the center of the dream rose a black pillar that swallowed light itself, and always he awoke with his heart pounding and tears in his eyes, unable to remember the names that called him. Far beneath the miners' shafts lay another secret. The quiet forge, a forgotten mechanicum station buried in the planet's crust, still pulsed with forbidden machinery. Its master, Magos Nymiar, was more machine than man, obsessed with secrets no one should pursue. When his sensors marked the arrival of the strange child, he investigated. When he saw Izar, he trembled. The flesh was no ordinary flesh. It was the Emperor's design. It was a fragment of gene seed walking in human form. Nymiar whispered to himself, "Fragment AXE," and his obsession became worship. He lured Izar into his laboratory, drew blood, dissected cells, charted metabolic rhythms. He saw patterns matching the Primarch project, yet broken, as if pieces had been deliberately erased. He concluded that Izar was one of the forgotten, an experiment the Imperium itself had sought to hide. And in the name of restoring him, Nymiar began his work. He laced iron into Izar's bones, infused metallic reagents into his veins, rewired nerves with synthetic warp-dampening membranes. The boy grew more powerful, more unbreakable, but emptier as well. The dreams came harder, louder, more vivid. He felt as if something had been cut from his very soul. While Nymiar whispered to his machines, the people of Dros Lysara suffered under the guild lords and their mercenaries. The miners broke their bodies for quotas they could never meet, and the guards punished failure with blood. Izar watched, silent as always, until one day an old man was beaten half to death before his eyes. Something within him shattered. He stepped forward, fists clenched. The mercenaries laughed until one punch sent a man crashing through stone. The laughter died. He fought them all, breaking knees and arms, scattering their weapons like toys. He killed no one, yet none could stand against him. From that night, The Skira saw him not just as one of their own, but as their protector. They carved a sign to honor him, a half-sun sinking below the horizon. They called it the Lamd Sun, hope not extinguished, a day not yet ended. But Isar felt no triumph. Each night the dreams dragged him deeper. He saw his brothers more clearly now, giants with eyes like stars, banners snapping in storms, voices speaking in tongues he nearly understood. Each time he tried to remember their names, the memory dissolved. He woke gasping, haunted by the certainty that he was not meant to be alone, that there were others like him, and that somewhere, someone had torn him away from them, had bound his fate in silence. Thus began the life of the lost Primarch, born of the Emperor, stolen by the warp, raised among the forgotten, experimented on by the faithless, haunted by memories that were never his to keep. A shadow written out of history, a fragment erased, a bearer of a burden no child should ever have carried. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of his horrifying tale. The years passed on Dros Lysara, and the boy who had fallen from the stars grew into something the Skira both revered and feared. He worked among them, carried stone on his shoulders, defended them against guild guards, and bore every weight they laid upon him. Yet no matter how deeply he dug into the earth, his dreams dragged him upward, beyond the poisoned skies. He longed for something he could not name, a truth always hidden just beyond reach. Magos Nimiar whispered to him more and more. He spoke of things the miners did not understand, of gene seed, of brothers scattered across the galaxy, of the Emperor whose shadow stretched farther than stars. At first Isar dismissed the words as madness, but fragments of memory stirred within him when he heard them, pieces that did not belong to him yet fit too perfectly to ignore. Nimiar pressed harder, insisting that the boy was not meant to live among tunnels and slag, that he was the vessel of something greater, a fragment of a design erased from Imperial record. He promised answers if Isar would submit to further experiments, but Isar resisted. He wanted no more needles in his veins, no more iron grafted into his bones. He wanted truth without chains. The more he resisted, the more Nimiar grew desperate. The Magos whispered in the ears of the guild lords, and in secret they began to fear what the boy had become. They saw him not as a protector, but as a threat to their control. Together they conspired. It began with whispers in the tunnels, rumors that the boy was not human, that he was cursed, that his strength was not a gift, but a blasphemy. Fear took root where gratitude had once grown. Isar did not blame them. He knew himself that he was not like them, and perhaps could never truly be. When the mercenaries returned, this time in greater numbers, they did not come to collect quotas or enforce debts. They came for him. The battle was short but brutal. Dozens fell before him, bones broken, blood soaking the dust, but for each he threw aside, 2 more rose. He refused to kill them, refused to become the monster they claimed he was. And so he was dragged down by sheer numbers, bound in chains forged with psychic dampeners Nimiar had designed. The Magos stood over him as the people he had saved turned away in fear. "You are not theirs," Nimiar said softly as he knelt beside him. "You never were. You belong to the stars, and they will reclaim you. I will not allow you to rot in tunnels. I will give you purpose." Isar struggled, but the chains held. He was carried through the shafts, past the people who had once raised the sign of the Lamd Sun in his honor. Some looked away, some spat. A few wept silently. None came to his aid. He did not curse them. He only carried their faces with him as he was dragged to the surface. For the first time in his life, he saw the poisoned sky without the filter of stone. Acid winds howled across black plains. Lightning crawled across a bruised horizon. Above it all, stars burned cold and distant. For a moment, despite the chains, despite the betrayal, his heart lifted. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast, a step away from the truth that had haunted his dreams. Nimiar's vessel waited there, a jagged construct of iron and prayer, engines coughing fumes into the storm. The Magos oversaw preparations, chanting Benaric litanies, his voice blending with the hiss of servitors. When they lifted Isar onto the ramp, the world itself seemed to cry out. The winds rose to a shriek, the lightning split the heavens, and the black clouds churned like an opening wound. For a heartbeat he thought he heard voices on the storm, the same voices from his dreams, calling names he could not remember. He was thrown into the belly of the ship, chains clattering against steel. The hatch sealed, drowning the storm in silence. The engines roared, lifting him from the world that had raised him, from the people he had protected, from the earth he had borne upon his shoulders. As the ship pierced the clouds and the poisoned sky fell away, Izar saw the stars clearly for the first time. They did not comfort him. They were endless, cold and cruel, a vast black sea where even giants could be lost forever. He whispered only one word, though he did not know if it was a prayer, a curse, or a promise. Brothers. And so began his exile among the stars. The ship that bore him away from Dros Lysara was no proud vessel of the Imperium. It was a scavenged construct of iron and prayer, half machine god hymn, half crude engineering, its walls groaning with every shudder of the engines. Chains clamped around his wrists and ankles, etched with runes that bit into the skin, psychic dampeners pulsing faintly to sap the fire from his blood. He did not fight them. He could have. He knew that with one heave he might have torn the chains and crushed the skulls of the guards who surrounded him. But to what end? The people he might have fought for had already turned their backs. He had promised himself never to kill without need. So he sat, silent, listening to the ship as it clawed toward the void. The Magos visited often. Nemiar's voice was a dry whisper, equal parts reverence and hunger. He called Izar the fragment, the forgotten design, the proof of something the Imperium itself had buried. He spoke of a destiny written in erased lines. Izar ignored him. When he did speak, his words were few, questions that Nemiar never fully answered. Why me? Why forgotten? Why cast aside? Each time the Magos smiled with the patience of a spider and said only, because you are more than you know, and less than you were meant to be. Days stretched into weeks, the stars wheeling beyond the portholes. To Izar, they were no longer cold and distant, but sharp, like blades pointed at him, countless watchers reminding him of his smallness. At night he dreamed again of his brothers, clearer than ever before. He saw one wielding a blade of fire, another cloaked in midnight and shadow, another crowned in lightning. He felt their voices pressing against his skull, muffled, broken, but desperate to be heard. And always the dreams ended with the black pillar, swallowing every light, every sound, leaving him gasping awake with the taste of ash in his mouth. Nemiar noticed. The Magos recorded each twitch, each shiver, each fragment of whispered names that Izar could not remember when waking. The warp is reaching for you, he murmured one night as Izar convulsed against his bonds, sweat soaking his body. It remembers what the Imperium tried to erase. It will show us truths the Emperor feared to let survive. He touched the boy's face with cold metal fingers and Izar flinched. It was not long before the ship strayed too close to a storm. Warp tides rose, dragging at the hull, bending reality around it. Lights flickered. Metal screamed. The crew prayed in half-mechanical voices. And in the storm, Izar felt a presence press against his mind like a hand forcing open a locked door. He saw not his brothers this time, but shapes older and hungrier, eyes that blazed like suns, mouths that whispered promises of freedom, of vengeance, of power beyond imagining. The warp offered him what the Imperium had stolen, a name, a place, a destiny. All he had to do was yield. He resisted. He bit down on the screams and forced himself into silence. He would not accept gifts from shadows. He would not be a pawn to voices that smelled of rot and blood. But resisting had its price. His body thrashed, veins burning as if molten metal ran through them. Nemiar stood over him, recording every moment, praising his endurance even as the crew cowered from the warp scream that seemed to echo from his chained form. When at last the storm passed, the ship limped on, scarred and shaken. But Izar was not the same. The warp had touched him more deeply than before. He felt its echoes in every breath, a constant whisper at the edges of thought, promising that he was not alone, that brothers waited, that betrayal was only the beginning. He did not believe the voices, but he could not banish them. They haunted him as surely as chains bound his limbs. One night, as the stars wheeled in silence, Izar looked through the porthole and whispered to the void, "If I am forgotten, then I will remember myself. If I am erased, then I will carve my name into the stars." His voice was quiet, but in the hush of the ship it rang like iron. Even the Magos paused at the sound, unsettled by the weight of the vow. And so the exile continued, deeper into the galaxy, deeper into a reality warped by shadows. The boy who bore the weight would learn soon enough that the greatest burden was not chains, nor betrayal, nor even the warp's whisper. It was the truth waiting beyond the next star, the truth the Emperor himself had sought to bury. The vessel that carried Isar drifted into a system without light. The sun was a dying ember, its planets cold cinders. Yet on the third world there was fire, cities burning in eternal twilight, banners of war rising over shattered spires. The Magos brought his prize down upon it, eager to test how the fragment would endure beyond the tunnels of his birth. Isar's chains clattered as he was dragged into the open. The air tasted of blood and iron. Armies clashed in the ruins, armored warriors fighting for the favor of warlords who claimed divinity. They raised themselves as gods, carving their images into stone, demanding sacrifices of flesh. The people knelt in terror, giving their bodies and their children to masters who ruled with fire. Nimiar's lenses glowed bright as he whispered, "This is your proving ground, child. Let me see if the forgotten sun can rise." He loosed Isar into the carnage, not to free the slaves, not to fight for justice, but to observe. The Magos cared only for data, for evidence of what his experiment could become. At first, Isar resisted. He stood among the cowering throngs towering above them, refusing to lift his hands. But the warlords noticed the giant. They feared him. Fear turned to command and command to challenge. Warriors came with blades and guns to bring him down. When he refused to kneel, they struck. And when they struck, he answered. The ground shook with every blow. Blades shattered against his skin, armor splintered beneath his fists. Blood stained his hands, though he tried to spare lives. The people gasped at the sight and whispered that a god had come among them, a savior not born of their cruel warlords but descended from the sky. Wherever he walked, men fell, and the whispers grew. He begged them not to worship him. He begged them not to kneel. But the more he fought, the more they believed. Chains broke. Slaves rose. The warlords fell screaming, their banners torn and trampled into mud. And through it all, the people's voices lifted higher. A god walks among us, a god has risen, a god of flesh and mercy, not fire and ash. Isar recoiled. He was no god. He was only a boy stolen from his world, haunted by dreams of brothers. Yet he could not stop them. Wherever he turned, altars were raised in his name, symbols painted in blood and ash. They called him the bearer, the sun that would not set. They looked into his eyes and saw hope, but in hope was a seed of horror. For the warp watches where faith gathers, and in their worship shadows stirred. The voices that had whispered to him in storms now spoke with clarity, urging him to accept the crown, to let himself be exalted. They promised that if he embraced their worship, his brothers would be restored to him, his name would be remembered, his place among them returned. He refused. Each night he stood before the people and tore down their altars. Each day he shielded them from the wrath of the surviving warlords. He told them he was no god, that they must not raise him to divinity. Yet the more he denied them, the more they loved him. Denial only made their faith stronger. Nimiar watched with delight. His data scrolls overflowed with proofs. The fragment was not only strong, but charismatic, born to command, destined to inspire. He saw in the crowds a reflection of the legions that might have been, and in Isar the leader who might command them. He whispered into his vox recorders, the Emperor's erasure was folly. The fragment was never weak. It was only dangerous, because it could be more loved than the others. And as Isar tried to resist the title of God, he began to fear something greater than chains or warp whispers. He feared himself. For in his heart, when the crowds cried his name, some hidden part of him wanted to answer. Isar had broken the warlords. He had refused the crown the people tried to press upon him. He had rejected the title of God even as they sang it louder. Yet no denial could silence faith once it had taken root. Wherever he walked, altars rose, prayers followed, and the shadows of the warp thickened around him. Faith drew them like blood in the water. At first it was only whispers. Dreams turned sharper, voices promising strength, visions of banners raised in his name. But the visions soured, grew grotesque. He saw himself enthroned in fire, his hands dripping with blood, his brothers kneeling before him in chains. He woke trembling, bile burning his throat. He swore it would never be. He swore he would never bend to such lies. But resistance was not enough. The more he fought against worship, the more violently the people clung to it. They built temples in the night, carved his likeness into stone, sang hymns to his mercy and his wrath. When he smashed their idols, they built more. When he told them he was no god, they insisted he was only testing them. The harder he pushed, the stronger their devotion grew, until he began to feel his own words were swallowed by a tide he could not hold back. The Magos watched all of this with cold delight. Nymear's augmetics gleamed as he recorded every cry, every altar, every desperate act of worship. To him this was proof that the fragment was not only strong but dangerous, loved too deeply, too easily raised above all others. He whispered to his machines, this is why he was erased, not because he was weak, but because he could have been more loved than the rest. When the warlords were gone, the people looked only to him, and in their eyes he saw chains heavier than any metal Nymear had bound him with. They begged him to lead, begged him to bless, begged him to destroy their enemies in the name of faith. He wanted only to free them, yet the more he freed, the more they clung. He had broken one set of shackles only to replace them with another. It came to a night when the skies themselves burned red, when lightning split the clouds and the ground trembled. The warp's voice was no longer a whisper. It screamed. It promised him brothers. It promised him a name. It promised him remembrance. And when he fell to his knees in the dust, ears ringing with that endless roar, he almost answered. He almost accepted. But he looked up, saw the faces of the people pressing close, saw their eyes wide with terror and hope, saw how utterly they depended on him. And he knew that if he accepted the warp's gift, it would not be salvation. It would be damnation, for him and for them. He stood, fists clenched, and shouted into the storm that he would not kneel. The storm broke, but the people had seen his weakness. The sight of him on his knees, whispering to shadows, broke something in them. Their prayers grew sharper, more desperate, less like love and more like chains. In their faith he saw his own prison. He understood then that the greatest damnation was not to be enslaved by enemies, but to be chained by those who loved him too much to ever let him go. From that night forward he carried the weight of two burdens, the voices that promised him eternity in the warp, and the people who would never free him from their worship. Between them he felt the walls of his fate closing in. The worshippers who had raised him as a god were gone. The warlords he had broken were dust. The Magos who had chained him was silent now, buried under the wreckage of his own ambition. Izar wandered among the ruins, stronger than ever, but hollow, his chest echoing with a hunger that no victory could fill. The stars above offered no comfort. They stared coldly back, indifferent to his struggle, and every night when his eyes closed, he felt the weight of the dream return. In the dream he stood among giants. They were his brothers. He knew it with certainty, though their faces blurred, their voices drowned in static. Yet sometimes the veil would thin, a laugh carried on the wind, a word half-spoken, a hand gripping his shoulder in silent solidarity. He would reach for them, desperate, but the dream always broke, replaced by the black pillar swallowing light. He awoke gasping, fists clenched, his own voice raw from shouting names that dissolved as soon as they passed his lips. The people he tried to lead did not understand. They saw only strength, only the giant who broke their chains. They called him Father, Lord, Deliverer. But when he told them he was none of those things, when he spoke of brothers lost and forgotten, they grew afraid. For to them, gods could not grieve. Gods could not weep for family. Their faith demanded perfection, and in Izar's grief they saw weakness. Faith that had once burned bright began to falter. He turned inward. He began to carve the faces he remembered into stone walls, desperate to hold on to their outlines before they faded entirely. Rough, incomplete, blurred, just as they were in his dreams. He carried those carvings with him from place to place, monuments no one else understood. To others they were grotesque, meaningless idols. To him, they were the only proof that he was not alone in the universe. One night, as the wind tore across the ruins, he heard something new. Not the whispers of the warp that begged him to kneel. Not the chants of people raising him as God. It was a voice, clear, soft, carried not by the storm but by memory. Brother, a single word spoken as if beside him. He turned, heart pounding, but there was no one. Only shadows, only silence. Yet for the first time he believed that one of them had heard him. Somewhere across the galaxy, one of them had reached back. The certainty nearly broke him. If his brothers were alive, then they had forgotten him. If they remembered him, Then why had they not come? The thought clawed at him, tearing deeper each night. He imagined them standing in light while he rotted in exile, imagined them carrying banners while he carried chains. Bitterness grew sharp in his chest. For the first time he began to hate, and yet he also began to hope. For even the faintest echo was proof that the bond was not entirely gone. Somewhere in the endless dark the others still existed. Somewhere the black pillar had not swallowed everything. And he vowed that if it took his entire life, he would find them again. He whispered the vow into the void as though speaking to them directly. I will not remain forgotten. I will not remain erased. I will find you. And if you do not want me, then I will make you remember me. His voice shook with both grief and fury, but the stars gave no answer. The silence stretched on, vast and eternal, swallowing the words as it had swallowed his name. Still, he clung to the echo. It was all he had left of them. He left the cold system of broken idols behind and followed a trail only he could feel, a pull in the marrow like a compass pointing through the dark. It drew him across gulfs of lightless space to a cluster of worlds bound by the same wan sun, each one bearing the scars of wars that had never truly ended. Ships drifted as wreckage in orbital graveyards. Vox bands were crowded with pleading propaganda and the last songs of cities going out like candles. He listened, jaw tight, and set his stolen vessel toward the loudest cry. The first world was a furnace. Its continents were latticed with manufactoria that had eaten their way through mountains, drinking oceans for coolant, exhaling clouds of cinder. Firestorms rolled over plains of slag and the sky rained metals like red snow. There were people still, always people, clinging to ledges of survival between blast furnaces and conveyor gulches. When he landed, the air scorched his lungs and left flakes of black on his tongue. He stepped into the glow and the workers scattered from him as from a falling tower, until someone recognized the symbol carved once upon a tunnel wall long ago, the half-sun he had not drawn since Dros Lysara. They whispered it as if it were a prayer, the lamed sun. He wanted to tell them he was no sun, no God, no salvation. But the manufactorium sirens began to wail, and the overseers poured out in armored lines, each visor a mirror reflecting him back at himself, taller, broader, inhuman. He kept his hands low, open, palms out. It never mattered. The first rifle flashed, and the shot ricocheted from his chest to bury itself screaming in the iron behind him. After that, the crowd became a storm. He moved the way a mountain falls, inevitability given motion. He bent gun barrels to crooks, crushed plating into shields for the unarmored, and hurled the armored back into their own lines with care not to break what could be spared. When the foreman at the blast gate raised his power maul to cave a miner's skull, Isar caught the blow and felt the maul's field hammer along the bones of his arm. He met the foreman's eyes through the visor and saw nothing there, only quotas, only numbers. He took the maul away and cut the gate's power with it. The furnace roar faltered and then quieted into a breathless hiss. For one fragile minute, the world seemed to hold still. In the quiet, he told them to run, to scatter to the ash canyons and the coolant tunnels, to live anywhere that wasn't in the path of the fire. Many listened. Some stayed. Some looked at him as if he had just stepped out of a legend and could be stepped back into it if they shut their eyes. Children touched the scar along his wrist as if it were a relic. He pulled free gently and told them to keep moving. He had learned what faith did when it had nothing else to cling to. The manufactoria fought back like organisms that knew how to live without people. Security shutters fell with teeth. Auto turrets unhooded from the walls. The floor itself tried to swallow him with magnetized clamps. He answered with patience and precision, a wrench where a bolt would do, a shoulder where a door resisted, a thrown chain where a sensor eye needed to blink. He did not burn the hive from its base. He unplugged it from its hunger and walked away while it starved, leaving people alive behind him with a few more corridors of future than they'd had an hour before. He did not linger to receive what came next. Already he could feel the second world burning. He reached it after 2 jumps. Each jump a whisper of pressure on the back of his skull, a reminder that the Imperium had taken an interest it would never surrender. This world was a ring of cities strung around a polar sea, the water black with chemical night. War had come here not as industry but as doctrine. Whole congregations marched in lockstep to hymns that rose like smoke, each city certain that its neighbors were heresy given brick. The sky bloomed with flack flowers. On the ground, men in pale masks carried children by the arms and wrote confessions on their foreheads in soot. He went first to the quietest place, the hospital that had become a chapel, then a stockade, then a place where the sick were stacked like spare parts. A woman with silvered hair and a voice like sand asked him if he was there to bless the dying. He told her he was there to stop the need for blessings. She did not smile. She put a scalpel into his hand as if to say, "Then start here." He cut bandages and carried bodies until his arms dripped with the steadied weight of those who would never rise. When the hymn lines came to take the beds for the army, he stood in the door. The first line stopped because he filled their sight. The second stopped because the first had. The third kept coming and broke on the others like a wave on rock. A masked man put a hand on Isar's chest and pushed. It was like pushing a world. Isar only needed to breathe. The man stumbled back and landed with his hymn half finished. Isar told them to go home. They could not hear him in the mask's echo chamber, but they could read the shape of his refusal. Violence came anyway. It was a smaller violence than he had known on the furnaces, more brittle, more righteous. Righteousness breaks quickly when it finds itself outmatched. He broke it with as little blood as he could manage, took the masked men's batons and snapped them like stale bread, took their banners and tied them to the ambulance wagons for tourniquets. He told the silver-haired woman he would be back. She told him he would not. He did not argue. The third world was not fire so much as choking smoke. Forests that had stood since before the first vox crackled were now stumps in the shape of a regiment's march. The people had built their houses in the trunks and came down every morning like fruit to barter for axe heads and commutations. Here war was a schedule: cut, stack, burn, repeat. He put his hands flat to the trunk of a tree older than the memory of who had named it, and felt it resonating with a low, exhausted groan. When the overseer arrived in a crawler and shouted quotas through a horn, Isar stepped in front of the saw and let the blade meet his palm. It screamed and sparked and finally confessed it had no power over him. The cutter crew stared with the helplessness of men who have been told the tide is canceling itself. He was not a tide. He was a man that they mistook for one, but he used the mistake like a tool. He told the crew to go home. He told the crawler to get out of its own way. He told the saw to sleep. The saw obeyed because he broke it. The crawler obeyed because the driver could not meet his eyes. The crew obeyed because they wanted to, and because the world had just offered them permission through the mouth of a giant. He did not stay to plant banners. He left a line of quiet where there had been noise, and a rumor where there had been orders. And the rumor went farther than any order. That somewhere between stars a figure walked who was not a god and would not be one, but whose hands could stop a furnace, a hymn, a saw. Rumors become stories. Stories become cult. Cult becomes invitation. The warp listened with its patient hunger. Nights in transit were the worst. The dark between systems had a texture now, a grain he could feel under his thoughts. He lay with his hands laced behind his head and tried to hear nothing, to be nothing. But silence is not absence. It is only a shadow. In that shadow, sometimes he would hear them, his brothers, just at the edge of speech, sharing an old joke, calling a rally, swearing an oath. Once he heard a name. He said it out loud and tasted iron. It was gone by the next breath, devoured by the black pillar that stood where his memory ended. He slept little. When he did, he woke clenched, braced for a blow that had not yet fallen. On the fourth world, the fall began. It was a shrine world without a shrine, its cathedral never finished, its stones looted for fortresses, its reliquaries empty. The people had made relics from what they had: bones, badges, bullet casings. They had arranged these on shelves and called them ancestors. A warlord had come to curate their grief and tax it. He wore the bones of martyrs on his chest and spoke with a voice that could make any number sound like a hymn. He knew Isar the moment the giant walked through his gate. Faith has a scent, and so does the refusal of it. The warlord wanted both. He received Isar with open arms, offered him wine in cups carved from broken bells, asked him for a story in a voice that never asked. Isar said nothing. The warlord smiled around the silence and led him to a balcony that looked out on the city. "They need a sun," he said softly, as if sharing a secret. "It does not matter whether the sun is true. It only matters that it rises. Will you rise for me?" He did not say, "an eye for you." He did not need to. Isar told him no. He told him the city did not need a sun that could be switched off when convenient. He told him people could stand upright without a light behind them if someone taught them how. The warlord's smile folded at the edges like paper meeting flame. He said very gently that he would show Isar what people did without sons. He signed with 2 fingers. Somewhere below, a bell rang. In the streets, the soldiers turned their faces toward the balcony like flowers. The first volley tore lines out of the stone beside Isar's head. He stepped backward into the shadow of a pillar that had pretended to be holy. So long it had forgotten it was just weight and shape. The second volley came higher. The third would have been lower, but by then he had dropped from the balcony and landed in the street like a falling star, shock rippling through the crowd. He did not reach for the warlord. He reached for the weak link, the banner-bearer with shaking knees, the gunner whose shoulder remembered a childhood injury, the officer whose voice cracked when he shouted. The ship was not salvation. It was a cage with golden walls. When Isar stepped across its threshold, he felt the press of familiarity in every echoing corridor, every sigil etched into the armor of the giants who stood guard. These were not mercenaries or slaves. These were warriors bred from a gene line he almost recognized, soldiers whose every breath carried discipline. For a moment, he thought he had found his kin. For a moment, he thought the silence was broken. They treated him as both guest and prisoner. His chains were gone, yet every eye was a watchtower, every door a locked gate. They called him by a name he did not know, but which felt like his own. They told him that he was remembered, that he was not erased but hidden, kept safe until the time was right. Their voices were calm, even kind, but beneath kindness there was steel. They were not his brothers. They were the echoes of his brothers, fragments of a legion that should have been his, bound to masters he had never sworn to. The commander came to him one night, clad not in armor but in the robe of ceremony, eyes sharp with both pity and calculation. He spoke of the emperor, of loyalty, of the Imperium's endless war. He told Isar that the emperor had not forgotten him, that he was needed, that his people, the true people, waited for his return. He offered him command, not of memory or dream, but of armies that knelt already at his feet. Isar listened, heart pounding, desperate for truth. Yet the words rang hollow, for if the emperor had not forgotten, why had his capsule been abandoned in the warp? Why had he been left to crawl through tunnels and carry the weight of strangers' chains? Why had he grown with silence where memory should have been? He asked these questions, voice shaking. The commander answered only with silence and the faintest smile, as if to say the questions did not matter. The betrayal began in whispers. A medic who tended his wounds spoke of orders that would never let him leave. A warrior who sparred with him admitted that his strength was feared more than honored. A scribe who recorded his words warned him that every syllable would be rewritten to suit the Imperium's truth. Slowly, the golden cage revealed its bars. They did not want a brother. They wanted a weapon. When he realized this, rage welled within him, hotter than the furnaces he had broken, sharper than the saws he had stopped. Not because they had lied, lies he expected, but because for the briefest moment he had believed. For the briefest moment he had thought he was home. That was the deepest cut of all. The voices of the warp stirred again, laughing in the dark, offering him solace in the only way they knew. "We told you, brother. They do not want you. They never did. Take our hand. Be remembered with us." He clenched his fists until blood ran from his palms, refusing them even in his fury. Yet he could not banish the echo of truth in their words. When the attempt to bind him came, it was almost gentle. An honor guard escorted him toward the sanctum where the commander waited, a place of oaths and fire. He knew before the doors closed what it would mean. They would strip him of name and memory again, reforge him in the Emperor's image, make him another blade in a war he had not chosen. He had lived in chains before. He would not live in them again. The guard did not expect him to fight. When he did, it was like a storm breaking free of a bottle. Armor buckled, weapons shattered, men fell with bones screaming against the weight of his hands. He did not kill them all, but enough fell silent that the rest fled. He tore open the sanctum doors and faced the commander. No words were spoken. They fought in silence, the clash of fist and steel echoing down halls built to last 10,000 years. When it ended, the sanctum burned. The commander lay broken, not dead, but broken, eyes wide with shock that the forgotten son had refused his place. Isar stood over him, chest heaving, and whispered, "If I am erased, then I will write myself again. Not in your books, not in your wars. In fire you cannot smother. He fled before the ship's alarms could cage him once more. He fled into the void, carrying nothing but scars, the taste of betrayal, and the knowledge that even among those who called him brother, he was alone. The stars are wide, but there are few places where the Imperium's shadow does not reach. Izar learned this when the first Imperial warships found him. They came like blades through the dark, prows carved with the Emperor's sigils, their vox horns declaring words he did not want to hear. They called him son. They called him commander. They called him forgiven. But every word was a chain. Every syllable meant surrender. He did not answer. He turned his stolen vessel into the dark, weaving between dead moons and broken stations, but the Imperium ships were relentless. They wanted him alive, not destroyed. To them he was a lost fragment returned, a prize too valuable to break. To him they were hunters, and so the chase became a war. The first clash came above a world of oceans, its surface torn by storms that mirrored the battle in orbit. Thunderhawks screamed through the void, their bellies heavy with warriors clad in ceramite, eyes like his but not his, brothers and not brothers. They boarded his vessel, chanting litanies, raising bolters in salute and in threat. He met them barehanded. He tore their weapons away and struck them down with the mercy of broken bones instead of death. Each time he spared them, they stared at him with confusion. Was this pity? Or was it arrogance? They could not understand that he had sworn never to kill his own blood, even if they did not claim him as kin. The second clash was not so merciful. They brought chains heavy with psychic wards, machines designed by the Mechanicum to cage something greater than human. He broke them, but in the breaking he broke men as well. Their bodies shattered against the steel, their blood painted the walls. He had not wanted it, but war has a way of pushing mercy to silence. When the fighting ended, he stood in a corridor lined with the dead, and for the first time he felt the weight of what he had done. The warp whispered approval. He spat and cursed it, but his hands still shook. Then came the voice. It was not Nymear, not a commander, not a faceless guard. It came through the vox in tones he almost recognized. Calm, measured, resonant with authority that could bend 1,000 worlds. It called him not fragment, not forgotten, but brother. The voice spoke of forgiveness, of family, of the Emperor's dream. It promised him a place among the stars, a legion to command, glory without end. For a heartbeat, he believed. For a heartbeat, he felt the black pillar shudder. But then he remembered Dros Lysara, the people who had knelt against his will, the chains of worship, the lies of Nymear, the golden cage of the false legion. He remembered the silence when he had cried out in dreams and no one had answered. And he knew that this voice too was a chain. He answered not with words but with fire. He turned his vessel toward the largest Imperial ship, engines screaming, and hurled himself at their blockade. Weapons raked across his hull, void shields collapsed, alarms shrieked, but he did not falter. He rammed through their line like a meteor. For a moment the void was fire and iron and fury, and in that chaos he slipped free. The Imperium did not forget. They would not forgive. His name, erased once, was now whispered again in records sealed with red. A lost son, a rogue fragment, a Primarch who would not kneel. They called him traitor, exile, heretic. He bore the weight of all those names, and though he had not chosen war, war had chosen him. When at last he drifted into silence, the wreckage of his vessel bleeding sparks into the dark, he whispered a vow to the stars. If you will not have me as brother, then I will stand as enemy. Better a curse remembered than a son forgotten. The warp laughed at his oath, delighted. The stars gave no answer. And so he floated on, the clash unresolved, the war only beginning. The void did not forget him. It never forgets its own. The Imperium chased him from world to world, its fleets hunting his shadow, its scribes blotting out his name. Every record that spoke of him was sealed, every whisper marked heresy. But still the rumor spread. A giant who bore no banner, who refused gods, who fought the Emperor's sons but spared their lives, who walked among slaves and left them free. The Imperium named him traitor. The people he touched named him savior. The warp named him brother. And none of these names were his. He drifted through broken systems, worlds in ruin, colonies abandoned to ash. Wherever he set foot, he left scars. He broke chains, but in the breaking he sowed fear. He offered no creed, but in the silence men built one for him. He swore he would not be worshipped. but every denial carved his image deeper into their faith. He became less a man and more a ghost, a story traded in the dark, a god against his will. He hated it, but he could not stop it. The voices in his dreams never stopped. Sometimes they were his brothers, sometimes they were things far older. Once he saw a vision of the Emperor himself, standing tall and radiant, face hidden by light. The figure spoke, but Isar could not hear the words. He reached for him, desperate, and the light shattered into the black pillar that had haunted him all his life. When he woke, he wept, not for the father he never knew, but for the memory that had been stolen from him before he could ever claim it. He came at last to a world without a sun, its skies lit only by the glow of magma rivers that cracked the crust like bleeding veins. Here the Imperium found him again, not with words this time, but with fire. Entire regiments landed, their banners snapping, their prayers loud enough to drown thought. They did not come to capture. They came to kill. Isar met them not as a god, not as a general, not even as a brother. He met them as a man who bore the weight of too many chains. The battle shook the ground until the magma rose and swallowed cities whole. He fought until his arms bled and his breath tore like knives in his lungs. Bolters roared, blades rang, voices cried his name, both in worship and in condemnation. At the heart of the battle he fell to his knees, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. Around him the Imperium's warriors hesitated, for even they could not bring themselves to strike the killing blow. He raised his eyes to the sky and laughed, a sound that carried like thunder across the burning plains. "You cannot erase me," he said. "You cannot chain me. If I am curse, then I am eternal. If I am silence, then I will echo forever." The warp surged at his words, delighted, and for a moment the veil thinned. Shapes gathered around him, some familiar, some monstrous. Perhaps they were his brothers. Perhaps they were only lies given form. Perhaps it did not matter. The battlefield vanished in fire, and when the flames cleared, there was no trace of him. The Imperium declared victory, claimed the fragment destroyed, struck his name from the rolls once more. Yet in hidden places and whispers traded in the dark, the story endured. The bearer, the lamed son, the forgotten son. Some said he wandered still, chained not to stone or iron, but to the curse of memory itself. Others swore he had ascended, neither loyal nor damned, but something in between. And so his tale ended where it had begun, in silence. But silence is not absence. Silence is only a shadow, and shadows do not die.